Hey, I'll give a couple of seconds for folks to join in. Certainly appreciate everyone popping on here. Give us a little bit of time to talk through the value proposition for Vulcan Cyber, why we think it's important. Awesome. So why are we here today? Well, I think I'll start off with my name is Tony Taylor. I'm a solutions architect for Vulcan Cyber. Been in the industry for quite some time, as you can tell from the gray hair. I'm not a young man. Well, I'm not an old man either. So I'm kind of in the middle. Anyway, sat on the customer side for many years. Doing NetSec operations, all of the things that you would probably imagine would happen in that space, and understand sitting on that side of the desk. And so moving into sales, it helped a lot for me, understanding the disposition of the operations team, and what actually went into that role, and then having to build that bridge into working with development teams and things like that. So we want to talk through kind of how we position the value for something like Vulcan platform, what we do, how we approach it, and then where we think the market sits for understanding this particular problem. So we'll go through a little bit of introduction. I'll give you a little bit of a kind of a background of Vulcan, gave you a little bit of a background about myself, and then we'll start to talk through some of the things that make sense and why this problem exists, and where we think we can help. So if you think about the problem, as a whole, one of the things that makes sense is that I think collectively, from the industry's perspective, you can see that cyber risk really is business risk. So understanding that it's no longer just patching a machine or this or that. That it really, at the end of the day, if you think about business risk and the goals associated with the business, that it's understandably important to know where that risk is and how it affects the thing that makes your organization revenue. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about business groups, as we call them, or services or solutions, the product that's out there that you're providing to that customer as a consumable is something that's made up of technical assets that we kind of pool together to give you that risk disposition to make smart decisions on. So you can see here from some of this data that it's only become more and more relevant as time has gone on, and that the discussions happening in the boardrooms nowadays. So it's not something that happens in my case, the nerds that are actually doing the security work down in the trenches. It's actually happening at that macro level, at in the C's and V's. In management, in most cases, you'll see, the CISO and the CIO are constantly having that discussion collectively across management to understand, where to prioritize things based on risk and value. So, just a quick understanding of what this means in this particular space. It is something that's relevant for everyone to pay attention to. So, what we think we're doing and being able to bring all that data together really helps tremendously in understanding that. You can quickly see this Poneman quote here, that it kind of touches on the fact of how much time is being used for managing that whole vulnerability response process. And this could happen across multiple work lanes, which we'll talk through a little bit here as we go through the platform. So, how do we do that? So if you start to talk about the traditional space from vulnerability management, in most cases, you'll think of the big three infrastructure scanners and things that provide that risk-based data such that you can make decisions on. But today we have DevOps, and we have microservices, so Kubernetes and containers and images and all the things that go along with that. And I think ubiquitously we can see that cloud environments are pretty pervasive, and certainly something that I think most organizations are using today. So if you think about the concept of understanding business risk and working through that whole workflow from a vulnerability management perspective, a lot of times it's very disjointed along that journey. So different teams have different goals, different processes, different tools. So if you think about kind of where Vulcan plays into this space, we kind of lean on this right hand side where we carry the message and the work to that full life cycle type of a workflow. So we get that traditional scan data in from all of the tooling, and then we work to build that collaborative message. Again, I think it's appropriate to understand that, with the business risk conversation, you have to know that macro discussion top down and the micro discussion bottom up to be able to somewhere meet in the middle to collaboratively understand what your goals are and be able to make effective, smart decisions in a timely manner from the risk disposition data. So if you think of how the whole consolidation, the actual work that goes involved in triaging and fixing those problems, again, being able to collaborate that story along the way, at the end of that, being able to provide meaningful data points such that you can fill out, you can fill in any of the questions that might come along, from anywhere within the organization. So if you look here on the left-hand side of this particular slide, and promise I only have a couple of slides and then we'll get right into the actual demo, you can see a subset of the actual data points that we ingest today. So again, it's about bringing all that meaningful data in, really boiling it down, which is what we do in the middle. If you think of the early 2000s, the whole middleware concept, we plug in the middle to work to bring good inputs and provide actionable outputs and help drive those workflows and connect those teams together such that you can have a full life cycle of this particular workflow. So again, just touching on some of the points of the things that we do inside of the platform, and we'll walk through a lot of that here today. So by no means is this an exhaustive list, but certainly something that we think we can work from, at least from a discussion standpoint. So with that being said, real quick overview of what Vulcan is, a little bit of a background about myself. Hopefully you'll find this demo something that helps really kind of position the value proposition of something that Vulcan looks to do today. So with that, I will actually jump right into a demo. And let's grab this guy here. Awesome. So one of the things that we'd like to talk through is really, again, from that positioning of the Vulcan platform, is understanding, why we're doing it. We walk through the fact of the business risk conversation is really something that doesn't sit at any one point in an organization. At the end of the day, if you're not achieving your goals from a risk perspective, then it affects everyone. So, organization X, Y, or Z does and sells this particular widget. There's a service catalog that's built around that particular scenario that drives revenue, or in some cases, multiple service products that would build that. And underneath all of that are technical aspects that build in the relationships of how you actually drive work within the organization. So, again, bringing all that data in and understanding that is key to being able to drive that. So, as I mentioned, if you talk about the actual, let's see why my screen is not sliding here. There we go. So from a connector perspective, understanding how you bring all that input in. So we programmatically approach this by trying to bring all that data together. So if you think about the big three cloud providers, and I'll quickly scroll through some of this, your big three infrastructure scanners, all of your SaaS DaaS type tooling, any of your pen test type results, really kind of bringing all of that risk data together and boiling that down so that you can have that conversation across the board, and then being able to plug into things like Jira, ServiceNow, and some of your work tools on the back end, ticketing, things like that, to help work and plug all that together. And then, of course, if there's something we don't have, we have our kitchen sink connector in here as well, the Vulcan Report Connect X, which is literally the capability to bring in asset and risk data from any meaningful set of resource CSV XLS type data that you can map to specific dispositions and help enrich both assets and vulnerabilities. So we'll talk through a lot of this as we go through, just to help understand. I wanted to kind of quickly touch on the fact that on how we bring that data in. So if you think about the whole conversation, understanding that you've got to put the line in the sand to some degree. So we use really two KPI risk metrics to measure that. So the first is the security posture rating, and the other is the risk mass. Both of those together really help set the stage that you're actually working to achieve or not the goals that you've set in place for you yourselves as an organization. Whereas the security posture rating is a kind of a weighted average of all of that risk data across your business groups that have been created. Everything that we've pulled scan risk data in on is actually tucked into that security posture rating, where it's a risk average. Whereas the risk mass itself is more of that blast radius. So if you think of all of that data in one big bucket, and every time you do something, you're actually reducing that risk mass. So ideally, your security posture rating would be raising, and your risk mass would be lowering, and that's kind of telling the story that you're headed down the the trail of the path that you've set up for yourselves as an organization. So let's talk a little bit about how and why we do that. So if you think about the security posture rating, again, that being the line in the sand, or your risk appetite for yourselves as a risk threshold, you can think about everything below that is not meeting compliance, everything above it is. And we do this a couple of ways. Really kind of taking the conversation from an outside looking in and an inside looking out capacity, whereby the technical severity is going to be your traditional CVSS type scoring, any kind of that risk metric that's coming in from the tooling that you're already using within your environment. And then, of course, tacking onto that, another outside looking in capability is really the threat intelligence. So if you think about traditional CVSS and CVE risk scoring, at least in my opinion, in the existence of CVEs, in most of the cases, CVEs typically don't change all that much from the risk rating perspective. So it gets a CVSS score, it pretty much stays at in the perpetuity of its life. There are some things with CVSS3 where it's temporal scoring and slides the number to some degree, but you really don't see an impact on that, traditionally, until you start seeing things like the threat intelligence and the velocity of the threat actors doing new things. Things are now being targeted, being weaponized, and being exploited in the wild. So if you take those two buckets, we give you a pretty good lay of the land, so to speak, from outside looking in. But one thing we would never be able to do is understand the context of the business as well as you would in your own organization. So the whole tagging concept becomes hugely valuable, and being able to bring all that prioritization discussion really to light and get very granular on the capability and understanding, this is more priority over that. So if you take the concept of a service, we'll keep that, we call them business groups. A service is a collection of asset types that provide that consumable that may be generating revenue for yourselves as an organization. And then if maybe you have the same host, you have the same code, you have the same web service, all running in the same cloud environment, but yet one's prod and one's dev, you'd likely raise the priority of the production and maybe lower the priority as far as attacking that problem from a priority perspective. So being able to add that context to it immediately out of the box is something that we find is hugely valuable. From an SLA perspective, same type of a discussion. You have to have good, smart outputs on the compliance side of that piece in the workflow, whereby same dev prod type of an example, you could come in and create specific business group SLAs that are associated with sets of assets that are going to have different SLAs associated with them. Out of the box, we're going to give you that global policy that's going to apply to everything that's not tucked into a specific SLA. But you could easily come in here and create your own time weight scenario, compliance-driven initiative from an SLA perspective tied to a set of assets within the environment. That's hugely valuable in being able to kind of derive that whole discussion on who should be doing what and when. Capability from a role-based access, it's pretty granular in the case that we have, the capability to tie again to any business group. So if you had different companies internally, or there's M&A type activity and you're bringing some folks on, you need to look at the disposition, but you only want them to see their particular data, you can tie that to a business group along the way, or many different ways to do that, and actually tie that access capability within the platform straight away, from a specific role-based scenario. We have, tied into most SSO SAML type environments as well. So if you have some of that more granular authentication requirements in place, and you can pull that in as well. One thing I also like to touch on, just again from the plumbing perspective, is really understanding the fact that you almost always have to have an exception workflow as well. So we give you that capability to look in here and create those request types from an exception perspective also. So there's always going to be a need to say we can't get to this particular tool or this particular problem because we're waiting on vendors, or we can't do it 2 sprints out because of priorities and other things that may be coming in from a capacity discussion. Being able to add the capability for putting mandatory approvers in there as well. I think that's good from a compliance discussion, and stating that we had this exception, here's the workflow and the reasoning why. Oh, by the way, management X, Y, and Z were able to approve this, and we can actually track a lot of that data here in the exceptions workflow also. So as you can see, from an exception perspective, really understanding the disposition of those along the way is something that's critical to being able to answer those questions. So you can see the exception types and the status of those as it steps through. So I really wanted to just kind of quickly, give an overview of the plumbing in that case, such that you understand kind of how we're driving the math behind some of these workflows, and you'll get to see a little bit more of that as we step through. Awesome. So one of the things, and also from a questions perspective, if you plug them in, I think I see a couple coming in, and we'll try to get to some of that at the end. I'll work through the demo. I do have one of my colleagues on here as well, trying to maybe field some of that. But you certainly pop them in there if we have some questions. Then it's certainly certainly good. We'll try to get to them towards the end if we can. So if you think about bringing all that data in, and now we've got great inputs, one of the things that makes sense to look at from the platform's perspective is really understanding how do we get to the uniqueness of the problem. So understanding, if you've been in this space for any sort of time, you understand that there's tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of data points that are coming in from a risk perspective. As you plug in more tools, you're going to have more data points to deal with. And then you have to go through a process whereby you're trimming that down or merging or deduplicating or whatever buzzword you want to use to get to that unique asset focus and really to start, trim that down just so you can work into the prioritized risk. So we're trying to show you kind of the volumes of data that would be coming in here, and then a process whereby we're going to, come from the raw asset ingest, work through a unique deduplication merging process, and then finally arriving at a prioritized risk, both from an asset and a vulnerability perspective, which we'll talk through in these cases. As you step down through all of the scenarios, we have a couple of different things on this dashboard that kind of help you drill into that disposition and understanding what's happening within the data points perspective. So from that, let's talk about assets for a minute. Again, as I mentioned, one of the things to keep in mind is that while we call them business groups, a business group is a collection of asset types that really provides context around something that, in my case, in my opinion, is actually that consumable that you're going to create revenue for yourselves as an organization. That's your high value targets. It could be anything. Again, it could be a location. It can be an internal group. It can be a specific set of assets manually configured. Maybe there's some specific handful of things you always want to watch. In an operational technology environment, it's very specific to understand, engineering workstations as an example. Maybe you put that in a business group as an example. So there's lots of different ways that you can pull some of that risk data in to understand, where that context is. So as I mentioned, from a business group side, one of the things that we provide immediate value as we plug into all of that tooling. These are the tools that your teams are already using. So this context and these tags that are coming in are things that are already, there's already understanding about value and how we should focus on these various things in that particular environment. So any of these tags that we're bringing in as soon as we plug in can immediately be utilized to show value and priority based on the things that are coming in. So from that, to me, that's a pretty huge value add that I can provide immediate business context and grab those things and pull them together. So if I was to come up here and say, we'll use this web goat as an example. This is using some of the followed searches, which I can show you as well. And then on the output of that, or the outset, is that it's showing asset types from all categories in one particular business group. Now, this could be back to that production instance. You could have a production and a dev instance of this particular scenario, and understanding the value across all of those asset lanes and work lanes is really how you drive the prioritization message and be able to funnel the work to the right group at the right time based on the right context of that. So if you click into any asset here, this is a great example of seeing an asset from multiple sources. You'll see all the vuln disposition associated with it. Any other data that might be coming in from that particular data point. Again, you could also enrich in this with manual data as well. A lot of this is likely going to come across from the connectors. So any of the specific data points that are coming in, you see all the necessary things, any specific tags that might be associated with it. So, where does it exist within our environment, this particular, in this case, host? And what is the specific details associated with that? Same thing when you move on into the code projects, websites, web services. Now we're looking at SaaS, DaaS type tools, the images themselves. Again, I think it's quite likely to think that in most cases, many organizations are using some type of a containerized microservice environment. So there's quite likely image disposition somewhere out there, and of course, cloud resources. I think that it makes sense that it's highly likely in most cases that there's probably some cloud scenarios in place. We're going to give you a couple of quick ways to filter out based on source. Having the concept of unscanned, there's always a delta. You always got CMDB data, and then maybe no scans, or there's the agent never got installed on this particular machine, so you have no risk disposition data, but it's there. So you have to have a way to be able to kind of quickly slide that work unit over to someone who can go wrap up and trim that delta down on the things that are unscanned, so that you have a complete picture of the risk in your environment. As I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways that you can come in here and click out. Maybe I want to say, come show me all the stuff from Azure. Maybe I want to say risk level critical. There's all kinds of other ways I can come in here and pick this out. Now I've pushed that down. I'm actually only looking at 3 particular hosts in this case out of 32,000, understanding that I can quickly get to that data. I can save that search and then use that, as I mentioned in the business group creation, to be able to use pretty much throughout the tooling in the rest of the platform, all ubiquitously across. And I'll show you some of that as also. So if you come in here and click, maybe it's critical Windows external facing as an example. So same kind of external scenario where I'm at. I can see the specific hosts that are associated with that straight away and be able to understand quickly what makes sense to me. If I don't have a business group that I want to create, I can come in here and start creating things pretty easily. I can use that. I can use regular expression. We can start actually tagging specific things. I've followed save search, as I mentioned, the specific tags. All of those tags are available to you and useful to be able to create immediate value. And so once you create this filter logic very specifically on the things you're trying to build out, now I can apply the SLA, as I mentioned. I can also apply the impact as well. So now the whole dev prod scenario to be able to slide those levers up and down to understand which pieces make sense to focus on. So that's kind of a quick overview of the assets themselves and how we align the business group concept with being able to understand the value in the organization. Let's actually take a look and flip over to the vulnerability conversation and start talking through that as well. So you can kind of see the similar scenario where we're going to come through a raw ingest scenario, work through the scanner prioritize. So this is your high mediums, and then the prioritize risk, which are things that add the additional threat intelligence and things like that help you stay focused. We're going to add some things on this dashboard, your normal criticality banding that you can actually drill into. We start to show you some buckets of threat intelligence that are here. Obviously, things that are exploitable, you probably want to pay attention to. In my case, if I think about vulnerabilities, I would probably focus on maybe some medium crit vulns that show they're exploitable and weaponized now. So you can build some filter logic in here to actually start alerting me and showing me that these things are popping up in my environment. So if you've got specific business groups that traditionally your SLA for your medium level vulnerabilities is a little less visible, but you start adding some of that threat intelligence on it, it really starts to bubble that stuff to the top so that you can focus on those things. Of course, industry related in this case. Some of the things that are hot that may be news rearing. And then we start talking about the SLA breaching, and then, of course, remedies. One of the things that Vulcan has that I think is a value add from some of the other players out there is that we've got a collection of a lot of the fixes already pulled together for most of the CVE data that exists. So if there's a fix or a workaround, whether it be something that we've pulled together ourselves or that we've pulled out of somewhere out off of the public internet and pulled it back from some other partner and player in the industry, we've put it in this big database. And one of the cool things is that it's freely usable, freely available off of our website. So you can go to vulcan.io and actually go to Remedy Cloud from there, and you can actually search all of these fixes and pull together the data that we have in place to be able to use for remedying those problems. Well, the value comes into once you're a platform customer. Now then I can actually see this risk data, the patches and the fixes, and be able to correlate basically what are my biggest bang for the buck over my threat data. So now the context over my threat data with fixes that are available, so I can quickly ascertain things that might make sense to hit. So, and we'll talk through that here in a minute. So as we click into the vulnerabilities here, and you start to think about, at this point, we've gone through, we've pulled all of the ingest of data. We're starting to build, solid business group and service level slicing and dicing to be able to do both analytics and action. Now then, let's actually look at the work that's going to need to be performed. So now we're starting to talk about, what do I need to do? So back to that web goat scenario, if I come look at this, I've got data that's actually crossing all of the actual work lanes. So all asset types exist in here. So I've quickly pushed all the hay away, and I'm only looking at the needles or the pain points that exist within this particular business group. We've decided that this is critical. We understand that these are the things that we might need to look at. And you can see, if you start to look at these data points, you can see that these are code projects. This is a website. So if I want to say, oh, well, we know these things are good to go slide out, but we want to add that one as well, you'll see my take action actually goes away. And the reason being for some of that is it's quite likely that, if you think about the asset types and the separation of work associated with that, you're going to send your infrastructure, work to one team and your development work to another team. So it's quite likely that those are going to be different lanes of action that need to take place. So I would send these three, I'd come up here and I would fire these bad boys into Jira as an example. I would probably aggregate them into one batch. You're probably not going to make too many friends if you open up 100 tickets uniquely for similar type problems. So we give you that capability to aggregate that stuff in there. Again, tying into Jira, so now you have all of the projects associated with it to be able to pick the very specific things that might make sense for this particular unit of work. All of the various things that go along with it. If I want a specific SLA, I can do that as well. I can come add additional notes to it. And once I do this, I now have what's called a campaign. So I've taken these three, batched them up, shoved them into a particular Jira project, and now I have a campaign that's associated with that. So we created a playbook to follow along and track this, and we're using the campaigns to give collective visibility to all of that across the environment. So now I can see all the actions associated with it, any SLAs that may or may not be breaching, the vulns that may be attached to that, any source information that's associated with it. And I can click into any one of these and understand what might be happening within that environment. So any given point, I have all the tickets that might have been created from that, any kind of status on the vulnerabilities that are actually being worked, any of the activity that's associated with this particular campaign as well. Ideal being, as we work through this, plugged into Jira. So both Jira and ServiceNow are kind of a two-way connection. So if the work happens on they never enter into the platform, and the work happens on the other side, and they close that, we'll get that status here on this side as well. Conversely, if the actual work's done and we ingest new vuln data and it's been resolved, we'll go back in and close that Jira tick out also with that status. So it really kind of gives you two ways to look at that particular capability, all while being very efficient in the workflow because it's programmatically being managed. So if you think about the vulnerabilities, outside of the actual playbooks themselves, and just looking at kind of the saved searches as an example, same type of tooling, same type of capability along the way, both from the assets and vulnerabilities, quickly getting to the things that make sense. And we pick up a particular vulnerability and start to talk through it. So you're going to see all the necessary risk data that's associated with it, any threat intelligence and vuln tags that might have been associated with it. Vulnerability tags are going to allow you to create buckets of vulnerabilities very specific to like the tagging on the asset side, but specific to vulnerabilities. So if these need to go to development, these are group X or group Y, you can start to create some of those vulnerability tags to help create the capability to be able to slice and get to that quickly. This is actually a pretty good example of that medium vulnerability type disposition, whereby we're saying this is probably a high. You may didn't take a look at it. Whereas the CVSS type scoring is something that's may fall under the radar for a lot of teams, or something that it's going to be looked at second rather than stop, drop, and roll. So in this case right here, we're going to we show you all the relevant information, CWE, CPE, all the information that you're going to pull in from the various tooling that you can use for various things. We're going to show you the threat intelligence lanes and the data that we've pulled in from the various relevant sources. Again, we have it's a handful. We have our own team, as well as if you go to vulcan.io actually it's help.vulcan.io and then just search threat. You'll see all the sources that are associated with that. So that's something we can follow on from there as well. In this case, from a vulnerability perspective, understanding all the assets that are associated with that particular vulnerability. So this one vuln affects this particular, this many assets. And you also have the capability to come in here and say, well, I see that this is a staging box. maybe I want to come slide this up or down for whatever reason to show that it's not a production box. And while it's something that's probably needed to be resolved, it's not something that's externally facing or whatever the case may be. So you could do that individually on the particular asset, or you could wholesale all of those and change that for all of them as well. Maybe this particular vuln, it's buried in between 8 firewalls, and it makes sense to change that out. In addition to that, back to the Remedy Cloud, if there are fixes available, we're going to show that to you as well. So if you're using Ansible or some other type of a product, we're going to give you all those scripts. We're going to preload that script with all of the asset data so that we've gone and pulled all the fixed data together. We've actually built the script to hand to whatever tool that you're using to actually hit that button. You're in change control. The team says we've got all this, script's already preloaded. Okay, that's good. Now you can just fire that script away. I mean, again, I can fire that up, as I mentioned, and drop that straight into something, in this case, Ansible Tower, hand it straight, or whatever it's called, controller nowadays. You can pipe that bad boy right over to the tool and actually get to the end result very quickly. So another way you can actually slice and dice vulnerabilities is from clusters. So if you think about the unique vulnerability concept, you can get buried in the minutia real quick. But understanding things that might make sense from a vendor perspective, maybe I want to look at only things that are affected Apache, and again add things risk levels critical. So if it's Apache and critical, in this case they are. So we're actually only going to see those data points, right? So we can now then maybe we have a service team within the environment that only handles Apache or only handles Java or only handles this or that. So you can actually slice and dice based on vendor, affected software. I mean, so if you want to see only affected levels of software, you can get very granular. And again, save that search so that you can use to build other capability from being able to do work and or analysis on the data itself. So very quickly wanted to show, kind of high level, the way we actually slice and dice the vulnerabilities, some of the vulnerability data that we bring in, again, from all of the other tools and or your own data, again, from the Vulcan Report ConnectX. You can bring in your own enrichment data to be able to show risk disposition based on things that may not be coming in from another tool. We talked a little bit about campaigns and understanding the playbooks themselves, and how do we actually follow along the capability and the status from that. As we step through things, it makes sense to probably talk automation. At some point during the process, you've done this particular, seen this vulnerability or this set of assets or this business group. You've done this manually 5 times. We collectively understand as a team that this is something that we need to actually be looking at. So why not automate that? So you can come in and name that however you want. I mean, I could come in here and say things like, everything that comes in from Tenable that has a risk disposition of critical, that maybe has threat intelligence of remotely exploitable. Let's say that. Let's change that. Exploitable. So now I'm quickly saying Tenable, critical, remotely exploitable, is of asset type host. And now I can add even more granular information. So again, I can use those tags, as I mentioned. So we can come in here and all of that tagging. So you can get very granular to understand very specifically what it is that you're wanting to target from an automation perspective. So again, Tenable, critical, remotely exploitable, do these things. So now that I've gone through, every time we ingest data, we go through this playbook process and we look at it from an automation perspective, whereby we look at that, go through that filter logic, and then we do these things. Maybe we want to automatically open that Jira ticket, or maybe we want to automatically post to some Slack channel from a collaboration perspective, generate the scripts, and then, of course, the exception request as well. Maybe there's a specific vulnerability that pops its head. I can think of old printer vulnerabilities and things that were always very painful. You might want to create an exception request for that. Every time you see that new thing pop up, you've got XYZ things already in place to mitigate that. You want to write that exception request so that it's not lighten up the analytics for yourselves. In addition to the SLA breach actions, you can, as these things happen, you can add another email and action to that workflow process. So the automation to me is very powerful in being able to create that that people or person hour return on investment, whereby you need to do these things, the criteria, the high value target assets. You've already got all that built out because we brought all that data in and built the business groups. Why not automate that? So that's really where that value comes into play. because those things need to happen regardless of everything else. You shouldn't have to go hunt for those things because you already know that those are important. So let's talk about Remedy Cloud as well. So one of the things that I mentioned was understanding the value of this across the board. From your business context perspective, we've put in the time. If you've done this again for any amount of time, a lot of the effort is involved in validating that you have a problem, understanding the landscape of that problem, and then going and researching how to resolve that problem. So all of that work, we work to pull together in what is Remedy Cloud today. And then as soon as you are a platform customer and overlay that, we only show you fixes that are relevant to your specific business risk problems that are in place. So any of the vulnerabilities that you have are things that would make sense to actually go look at. So again, if I come in here and say, only show me my external facing business group. You've got some compliance initiative that says everything that's externally facing must be within X, Y, or Z. It must be green within this particular value by in the next week or whatever. So you could quickly come in here to the Remedy Cloud and be able to slice this based on risk mass. And so maybe 4 million is is the sweet spot to move you into the green, so to speak. So you could quickly come in and take care of this one issue. You can see all the necessary relevant information that it affects. Here's the affected assets. Here's the affected vulns that are associated with it. And so you can drive action straight from the remedies component as well. Again, some of the same capability to be able to drive and filter through all that, understanding what that means for you collectively as an organization. Maybe it's something across the entire org that you could do as well. So same kind of concept that you could drive from that perspective. That's Remedy Cloud, plugged in over the platform. Cool. So kind of winding up a little bit here. We've talked about the assets, talked about the vulnerabilities. How do we actually drive action? I think the end of this, really the output is understanding the analytics associated with it. So if you think about all of this type of tooling, if you can't actually report on the data itself in a meaningful manner in multiple ways and get to that data relative real time, then it really is all for naught. Because at the end of the day, these are the answers to the questions that you need to be fulfilling. So out of the box, we're going to give you a handful of things that you can look at from a analytics perspective. This being the SPR kind of trend data over the entire organization, so we can show you kind of your best and worst. All of that tooling that I've been discussing throughout the platform or throughout the demo is pretty relevant here as well. So I can slice and dice based on business group here, the asset types. All of this tooling exists pretty much across the board, such that you're not having to relearn different aspects of it. It kind of all flows together. So that trend data here on the SPR, what we're actually trying to show you over time, by risk level over time, asset type over time. That's the SPR. SLA tracking very quickly. Again, one of the things to keep in mind, we'll talk about that here in a second, is the business groups are very relevant to locking data points to specific focus if need be. So I could come in here and pick out specific business groups and then only see that data. So in this case, I'm looking holistically across the environment, but maybe I wanted to say show me only the external facing. So again, we have that compliance initiative in place. I can kind of see that I'm above my SO, or I'm good in the green there, but I have some things that are breaching. We probably need to take a look at. So being able to quickly understand what those things are, logging in here during a change control meeting and during a some type of a compliance meeting, you have capability to come in here and look at this stuff straight away. One of the things that I like to look at is this remediation performance here, the whole mean time to remediation concept. We all deal with the whole people, processes, and technology focused, dynamic, and understanding where we may have gaps is something I think that's huge in most organizations, and oftentimes hard to see unless you have the data points to kind of pull that out. So the whole mean time to remediation, give you that same kind of focus and trending over time, show you by business group, MTTR by business group, the trend over time, by risk level, asset type, and whether you do or do not have campaigns. Again, I think the more campaigns you have, the better return you have from an automation and an efficiency perspective. And then this daily workload widget, to me, this is pretty paramount in being able to answer that PPT type discussion, in that you always want to have as much understanding of the gaps for whether you are seeing more things being introduced and you're actually able to tackle as a team. If you look at this cumulative trend here and your graph is actually running away from you, then it's very clear that there's probably some gap in that whole people, processes, and technology space. And by using the filters that I mentioned, drilling into business groups, drilling into source type assets, you can understand very quickly on where those gaps might be. So it tends to reason that's that type of a data point is useful in most discussions across the board. And if you don't like the ones that we have out of the box, and we've taken all of those widgets and we've actually plugged them into a big bucket that you can actually come in here and create your own. Again, back to the scenario whereby I mentioned you could lock these things down to business group. So if I came in here and created company XYZ or customer XYZ, I could actually lock those down to business group on here as well and be able to provide a very specific focused data analysis to that particular, output. I can come and kick this guy out as a PDF if need be. There's a lot of different ways that you can slice that. I mean, you can export the data if pivot charts are your life and creating TPS reports is something that you enjoy doing. You can certainly come out here and export the data and do that as well. And if you don't like the data points that we have, we give you kind of a main line back into customer success and engineering, whereby if you come in here and give us a scenario and a use case for a particular data point, type that out and what type of a scenario you'd like to see. This actually comes straight back to the engineering side, straight mainline in, and it opens a ticket, and you kind of go down that path as well. So we've talked about a lot through this, and I'll click over here in a minute and see if there are any questions. But we talked about how do we actually position Vulcan platform in the value conversation. The whole risk-based conversation again is something that is not. It is not a one team type of a discussion. Collectively in the day, everyone needs to understand risk across the organization and how to quickly address that and who is responsible for that. So we think that by bringing in all the right data, being able to understand that data, put it together in some logical collaborative fashion where we can actually efficiently drive the output, it's something that will help tremendously in the market. And we're seeing that today. I hope you enjoyed this. This is something that's is near and dear to my heart from a risk perspective. I think Vulcan's doing a great job of being able to drive this effectively, and we hope that we'll see you guys along the way. So if there's any questions or anything, I'll kind of pop over here and see what we got. If not, we hope to see you guys somewhere down the line whereby we can use the platform for yourselves. Keep in mind that we do have a free option of the platform. It is called Vulcan Free. So if you log into Vulcan.io, there's a button up there on the website that says try the platform. You do that, it goes back to the team on our end. We fire up an instance for you, and we give you access to this tooling relatively for free, and so that you can drive it and see some of this stuff in your own environment. So I hope that this was helpful for everyone on this side. I think I'll pop over here and see if I do see any questions, and if not, we'll kind of wrap it up and then kind of go from there. Thanks again, Tony Taylor, Vulcan Cyber.